All right, everybody, David Parsons here. This is Nostalgia Trap. I hope you are doing well. Got a great conversation for you today. My guest is Sam Adler-Bell. He's a writer whose stuff you've probably seen in a number of wonderful left publications, and he has a really great podcast called Know Your Enemy over at Dissent Magazine. I wanted to talk to him this week about this amazing piece he has over at the Drift Magazine. At thedriftmag.com. Look this article up. It's called Dr. Dolittle, the Case Against Anthony Fauci. We have a link to it in the episode description. But it's about Dr. Fauci, and it's obviously, the title is self-explanatory, but what Sam does in this is lays out a sort of counter history and to the sort of hagiography that we're experiencing in real time about Dr. Fauci. And Sam reminds us of some really, incredible stuff that we may have forgotten about just this last year of the pandemic response. And for me, this was a really fun conversation because we took it, beyond just Dr. Fauci and into some of the, some of the deeper implications of this stuff. And even into, what you might call philosophical or spiritual elements of this political moment, because there's so much death and there's so much sort of visceral elements to what we're experiencing. It's hard to wrap your mind around that, and I think that we get to that place in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy this. We've got a whole lot more Nostalgia Trap stuff all over the place, but if you can find it in your heart and your wallet to support us at all, we really appreciate it because we're a totally independent operation. You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. We appreciate all the people who support the show. And you get access to all our bonus episodes. We just put up a really disturbing, I think, conversation with Justin Rogers Cooper about the Night Stalker documentary on Netflix. And we've got a live stream. We're live every Thursday at 1 p.m. Pacific time on YouTube, talking about the events of the day and trying to put them into our Nostalgia Trap framework. So again, if you want to access that stuff and support us, we really appreciate it. That's at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. And enjoy this conversation. Here is me talking with Sam Adler-Bell. Here we are, true podcast professionals. Thanks for joining me. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, we were just talking about the left podcast world. It seems like there's I think it's part of what I wanted to talk to you about today. Is sort of like what is the left moment right now, and we can get to that, I guess. Different.
Oh, sure. I didn't know we were going to talk about what is the left movement.
Well, we can get to that. Let's start with what I really contacted you about, which is that I found your piece in the Drift magazine about Dr. Fauci last week, and I think it was mentioned in the Washington Post even. That piece has some traction, man. It was all over the place. So congratulations on the success of that piece, but also what made you want to write about Dr. Fauci?
Well, thank you. I was really psyched to see the Post response to it. And it was basically like Daniel Dresner, like going through my piece, like responding to each part of it.
Right.
It was like, I sent it to my grandmother because it was like the Washington Post being like, as Adler-Bell says, at the beginning of every paragraph. To give credit where it's due, Noah Colwin at The Drift commissioned me to write this piece. And the folks at The Drift, which everyone who's listening should go ahead and read The Drift and subscribe because their stuff is really good. And it's like totally to the credit of the editors over there, Noah and Rebecca and Kiara, who figured out that like there was this piece would find its audience, which is to say that there really was no critique of Dr. Fauci from a left perspective that anybody could really point to. And there has been sort of a bubbling up of skepticism about him and his role and how kind of how he's been welcomed with open arms by the Biden administration. He's like the only person from Trump, like a very public face of the Trump administration, who has been just embraced entirely by Biden, including the other people who were involved in the public health response, like Dr. Deborah Birx hasn't been brought back. The Surgeon General was, fired basically, and most of the people who are sort of public-facing public health professionals in the federal government during, Trump's disastrous COVID response have suffered some kind of reputational consequences for it. And as we know, Dr. Fauci has not. He's beloved on the left. I mean, especially among liberals. Clearly, based on sort of the response to my piece, I can see that there are people, certainly, people who sort of share our ideological priors who were willing to be critical, but a lot more liberals, sort of, Democrat voting, good-hearted liberals who also really thought the piece made some good points. But anyway, that's to say that it wasn't my idea. It was my editor's idea. And the Drift, like, they're really good at kind of getting a sense of like what's in the ether and identifying a piece or commissioning a piece that kind of intervenes in some smart way. That's been my kind of experience with reading them, and working with them was really great.
Yeah, I think intervene is the right word, or just like cutting through, because it's like with Fauci's sort of the perfect character to do that with, because he's someone who is this. I think that the comparison you drew that made it make sense to me is like he's sort of like Robert Mueller, in that he's got this sort of like hero status for liberals that think he's this sort of guy that's represents the good and the rational and the moral within the administration or sort of confronting the administration. But that image is really complicated by the role this guy played in all of it, because your piece points out and goes back in meticulous detail. I think there's like amnesia already, and not only amnesia, but like what you point out is like real historical revisionism, where you're sort of like, wow. Can you talk about the mask thing? It's something I had forgotten about, because I think people, when I brought this up to a couple of friends that I was going to interview you about this piece, people said, "Oh, well, what's wrong with Fauci? What's wrong with that guy?" And I was like, well, just the mask thing. He said, do you remember what he fucking said about masks? So yeah, that part is intense, dude.
Let me be able to read you the quotes.
Yeah, I actually have it up too. And yeah, subscribe to The Drift, because this article gets into all of these things, and there are a lot of other really great pieces in here. But I'm finding the mask thing as well, because I was reading it out loud to my wife this morning, just being like, "Do you remember this?
Yeah.
Do you remember that this happened like not even a year ago?"
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I think this is one of the more damning things as far as like his public messaging. And especially, it's sort of something that we now live in this world where masks are this totally polarized political thing. Many more people who are liberals or leftists are willing to wear masks, and a lot of people in the especially conspiratorial fringes of the right, but really just a lot of right-wing people think of the masks as this like Democrat scheme. And we obviously might not have been able to avoid that outcome, but it's certainly the case that Fauci and the whole kind of government medical establishment really fucked it up and created the space, at least, for that polarization to happen. So some of the lines was that I went back and sort of followed Fauci's statements on masks. In February 19th, he told USA Today, "In the United States, there's absolutely no reason whatsoever to wear a mask." And that was February. So Trump had already had that conversation with Bob Woodward where he said this thing just goes through the air. People get it, not just from touching through the air, like that thing that came out subsequently. We knew this thing was moving through the air at that point. Anyway, and then on March 8th, you have Fauci telling 60 Minutes There's no reason to be walking around with a mask when you're in the middle of an outbreak. Wearing a mask might make people feel a little bit better, and it might even block a droplet, but it's not providing the perfect protection that people think that it is. And it sort of gets worse from there, because he then says that, wearing a mask he implies that wearing a mask could increase the risk of contracting the virus by saying, quote, often there are unintended consequences. People keep fiddling with the mask and they keep touching their face. Okay, so like,
dude, and that's the shit that I see. Because I look at Facebook, unfortunately, all the time, and I have a lot of fucking people on there that, obviously you see like all sorts of stuff around like, this sort of disinformation, and that's a frequently cited one. Not even they're like, even Fauci himself said that masks actually make it worse.
Right. Unfortunately, yeah. And so it's actually interesting. Like when I was researching this, there was like a Snopes article or one of these like fact checker, maybe it was ABC News fact checking or something, and it was like Fauci said don't wear a mask, and the fact checker decided, well, that's false, because this Facebook post was like using a video from February or March, so they were like, well, now the guidance is that you should wear a mask, and so this is false, this is misinformation. But it's like, that's kind of a ridiculous way to think about fact checking. It's like, no, it was wrong then, and people can still point to it, and he holds some accountability for the fact that he was wrong then. Obviously, there's the justification that they didn't exactly know at that point scientifically how useful masks would be. That's what people say. There's two justifications. One is that they didn't know entirely, first of all, that it was spreading asymptomatically. They didn't know the degree of aerosol spread. And the other justification is that there was a shortage of medical masks. I sort of go through in the piece why, first of all, on the science, that's not exactly true. Fauci had said that it spread asymptomatically in January. So we knew that people who didn't know they had symptoms were walking around with it. And the aerosol spread, as I already said, that we already knew it was spreading through the air. And of course, there was like the countries in East Asia that typically wear masks when there's respiratory disease outbreaks were wearing masks, because that's what you do. It's kind of insane.
Yeah, no, it seemed pretty obvious to me.
Yeah, and then of course, like the crazy thing is that like on April 3rd, the whole federal government switches. Like they switch their guidance from don't wear a mask. In fact, you're a bad person if you wear a mask if you're asymptomatic. I mean, the Surgeon General tweeted something like, stop buying masks, it's not effective. Like on February 29th. And a month later, he had to go up in front of the media and say, sorry, I know this has been confusing, but please wear a mask now. Like mere weeks before Fauci gave that interview to 60 Minutes where he said there's no point in walking around with a mask on.
And what your article points out is that in that moment where they're reversing themselves, Fauci is saying, well, this is something that it seems like kind of his MO actually is sort of to claim, well, this is because we have new knowledge and there's new science that has changed our position here. But as you point out, they knew about the asymptomatic thing in January. Yeah.
Look, I mean, it's the mask thing. There's a couple of other things that I point to that are kind of the easiest gotchas,
right?
With Fauci. I think the broader message that I wanted, or that your listeners should at least like consider when they start listening to this podcast or when they read the piece, is that like this is a guy who is the public face. There is no person in American government, in medical or science, in medicine or science, who is more representative in the public imagination of the COVID response. When you think COVID response, you think Fauci. And we all agree that the COVID response has been a fucking disaster, and hundreds of thousands of people are dead who shouldn't be. So how do we reconcile these things? Like, how do we reconcile the fact that this person who we all associate with the COVID response apparently has no responsibility for how bad it was? If you read the piece, you see that there's some reason to think that he does. But I think that a starting point for like just a conversation about Fauci and COVID and our sort of cult of expertise and the way that sort of like the liberal imagination in the Trump era, it has to start with this puzzle. Why is Fauci beloved? Why is Fauci not just being not held accountable, but is a hero when by any kind of rational judgment, you know, when a bureaucrat is in charge of some massive fuck up, you know, whether or not they have total control over it, if they are the public face of it, there's supposed to be some kind of accountability. And even if you have to kind of, you know, I didn't write this in the piece because it's a little inflammatory, but like usually when there's some kind of huge disaster and there's somebody who is plausibly responsible for it in the government. So like after 9/11, there were, you know, hearing after hearing after hearing where they brought the intelligence agencies and onto the, you know, into the Senate and into Congress, and they said, how did you not stop this? How did you not know it was coming? How did you not, come on, you know, like what went wrong? You know, what went wrong? What went wrong? And they entertained all these counterfactuals, you know, when the government representatives like are interrogating bureaucrats about a huge fuck up, they entertain counterfactuals, right? Mm-hmm. They'll be like, well, if you guys were communicating more, you know, that's how we got DHS, you know, was because they needed to create more interagency contact amongst the different intelligence agencies. Anyway, the point is that people have responded to my piece by suggesting that it's sort of unfair to entertain sort of speculatively if Fauci had done this, if Fauci had done this. But the reality is, under normal circumstances, when there's a huge fuck up, we entertain every single counterfactual because hundreds of thousands of people are dead. And if we don't think about what we could have done differently, then we will do the same thing again in the future.
Yeah, so. No, I mean, I think that's a great point. And what's interesting to me too about Fauci's hero status is he sort of, you know, he embodies a sort of the villain of so many Hollywood movies for years, like this sort of this bumbling bureaucrat. You know, he should be a hated figure, and yet he's not. And I think you have a few different compelling explanations why. But part of it goes back to, and this is what took me a second when Fauci sort of came back as a public figure to remember that I saw this documentary, How to Survive a Plague. Yeah, about ACT UP. And then I'm like, oh yeah, this is the guy that was in that movie. And he has this very particular history with the AIDS crisis where he's sort of a villain during that era. But, you know, it's sort of incredible how his reputation got sort of forged by that, and he recovered something. I mean, even him and Larry Kramer become friends, and Kramer at some point is like saying
him and Peter Staley are friendly too. Yeah, a lot of the ACT UP folks have warm feelings towards him.
So I mean, can you talk a little bit about how that evolution happens? Because it seems like, I think a key argument that you make in this piece is that Fauci developed a sort of strategy. And like a sort of strategy, and not only a strategy, but a sort of philosophy about the separation of politics and science, or their non-separation. I think that's a really important part of what you're laying out here.
Yeah. So the history is fascinating, and I recommend that movie, and the book that the movie's based on, How to Survive a Plague, is a great book. Yeah, and if you watch the first half or you read the first part of that book, you think, wow, Fauci is a villain. Mm-hmm. Larry Kramer called him a murderer in the pages of the, I think it was the Village Voice or something like that, an open letter. He was the enemy number one because as the head of NIAID, he was perceived in the 80s, or mid 80s, most of the 80s, as sort of as the figure who's holding back the access to experimental drugs for people suffering from the virus. And so, there was a bunch of money that was allocated to NIAID to do, to combat the AIDS crisis. And he was perceived as also poorly using that money and wasting it and just not moving fast enough. And so he was a major target of ACT UP and sort of the radical AIDS activist group. And there's a sort of turning point moment in the story where there's a big major protest. You know, ACT UP was famous for doing these really spectacular protests that capture people's imagination and are really aggressive. And they did one of those at the National Institute of Health, which is where Fauci's lab is. And the story is that Fauci basically sent somebody down, or he himself went down, I don't know exactly, and invited some of the activists up to his lab. He just said, like, come on up, let's talk. And that sort of started this dialogue where he started collaborating in some way with the activists, and thereby with a lot more patience, to develop some strategies for dealing with the crisis, including most consequentially making experimental drugs, changing the FDA's experimental drug pipeline to make it, them available to sufferers much earlier on in the process than they had been before. And it was a really radical change. He recommended it, it passed, and it was they did it. And so he was then sort of seen as a hero. And for people who are suffering from AIDS or people who were involved in that activism, Fauci was seen truly as a villain. But then by the end, Larry Kramer would say that he was the only true hero in the federal government during the AIDS crisis, during the worst of the AIDS crisis. And so, yeah, you have to ask, and that is, I'm not saying any of this, this is hugely to his credit. You know, I mean, totally, I think the fact that he there was a public outcry, there was a movement of grassroots movement pressuring the government to change its course, and these are the Reagan years. That Fauci ultimately stuck his neck out and responded to that grassroots pressure and changed and pushed to change course is completely to his credit. What I argue, based on a couple of different accounts of this time period, is that and some of the things that he himself has narrated about it, is that he developed a kind of protocol for dealing with the relationship between science and politics from this experience during the AIDS crisis. There's a piece in the Washington Post. Let me see, who is that by? Molly Roberts, I think. Mm-hmm. Which lays this out really well. Yeah, Molly Roberts. That basically he realizes that his idea of science as being this pure pursuit that isn't contaminated by politics at all, that politics and science have to be kept separate, that's an illusion. So that's the first thing, because he realizes that it's true. These guys, I'm becoming friendly with them. They're right. Their critique is right. That scientific establishment is not solving this disease because it's associated with gay men and other sort of transgressive figures in American social and cultural life. And so politics is obviously impacting how we're responding to this crisis. I can't in my mind pretend that that's not the case. But what he decides is that for the purposes of achieving his ends, for the purposes of protecting the sanctity of science or protecting good public health and scientific outcomes, he has to pretend in public that science and politics don't mix. So it's kind of a hard thing to follow.
Maintain the illusion.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It reminds me of the end of Dark Knight. Literally, for the good of the people, we're going to maintain this illusion that there's this objective thing called science. Yeah, that's separate.
But it's counterintuitive because, and I hope that your listeners are following this because it's complicated. Mm-hmm. At the same moment that he comes to the conclusion that science and politics are intertwined, he decides that for the purposes of achieving his ends as a scientist and as a federal bureaucrat, he has to pretend that he doesn't know that. He has to pretend publicly. It's a noble lie, like you're saying, a pious fiction that science and politics are actually isolated from each other. And the reason for that in the AIDS crisis, you can understand, is he wants to be able to present what he's doing as purely motivated by science. He doesn't want to go out in the public and say, oh, I talked to these like AIDS sufferers, these radical guys who convinced me that we needed to change the rules, change the scientific rules for them. He wants to say this is the best possible outcome. This is the best. This is in pursuit of pure science. This is what we should do. He doesn't want to bring attention, especially to, the Reagans and Bushes and conservative parts of the government. He doesn't want to bring attention to the political dimensions of AIDS, right? He wants to allow them to have cover to sort of say, okay, we got to solve this epidemic. It doesn't matter. We don't have to talk about gay men. We don't have to talk about drug users. We don't have to talk about anything like that. So for the purpose of achieving his ends, you can see how it made sense to, in the public, just talk about the science. I'm just going to talk about the science. I'm Mr. No nonsense, pure science. I'm going to give you the facts no matter what. But of course, we know that that's not true already, because he has said in these interviews, and Molly Roberts has documented well in that piece, that in saying I'm the guy who only cares about science, he knows that's not true, right? He's a political animal. He has admitted it, So it's a really complicated thing, and I think. Yeah, I guess I could just keep going on.
Well, it seems like a way of. It seems like to me, part of what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he's sort of like, this is a way of sort of getting out of responsibility for policy decisions by sort of like being like, I'm just the science guy, and the politics part of it is someone else, when he knows it's not true. And to me, it's like, I don't know. One question that comes out, because I think about ACT UP, and you think about like the thing that made him a hero to us in that scenario with the AIDS crisis in the 80s is that he's the figure that the left wants in some way, the one that's inside the system, that's able to respond to pressure and actually move policy in the direction that the left wants it to go. So in that sense, we're like, we need these figures, like absolutely.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I guess my question is, it seems like he was moved in part by how obvious, the fact that this was political, because it was gay men, and there was, this sort of like huge right wing that was mobilized against that. But like, I guess my question, and this is one that's open, is sort of like, what is the pressure group from COVID that's going to like make that happen now in the sense of showing like how political this is. I mean, we have like labor strikes going on, and sort of labor activity happening with grocery workers. And I mean, you've written about Amazon warehouses unionized. I mean, it seems like there's a similar sort of conversation going on at the same time. Like Fauci is absolutely untouchable, except by the right wing. I guess the right hates him.
Right. It's a very interesting question. I mean, just to underscore one more thing about what we were just talking about.
Sure.
I think it's important to understand that he is not, that his reputation as a teller of hard truths and facts, that's also just very much betrayed by his behavior throughout the pandemic. He's telling lots of noble lies. I mean, the mask thing is one of them, right? He's protecting the supply of medical grade masks by telling people that they're not important, that you don't need masks if you're asymptomatic. He knew that wasn't true, but it was supposedly a good thing to say to protect the pipeline of masks. Okay, so we know he's not just this, hard truth teller all the time. We know he admits to holding back with Trump. He wanted to stay in the room, so he couldn't contradict Trump too much. And when people respond to my piece, if they want to defend Fauci, that's usually what they say. Well, if he had pressured Trump too hard, if he had gone a step too far out of line, he would have been kicked out, and then we wouldn't have him in the room, and he was so important, he was so, we need some kind of defender of truth and facts inside the room. As I sort of argue in the piece, this is all becomes kind of internally contradictory, because if he's inside the room but he can't make any difference,
right,
what good is he being inside the room? But if he's inside the room and he does have influence, then he holds some responsibility for how bad everything has been. Anyway, so that's just an aside. But I think the question of COVID in politics and what role Fauci plays in that is a good one. I mean, one thing I think is that in this situation, Fauci's persona and public image, I think, protected the government from a lot more vitriol and maybe political upheaval than they might have faced otherwise. I mean, everybody who defends Fauci in reading my piece says, well, I just felt better because he was in the room, right? Like, I just made me feel better, you know? But that's another way of saying Fauci washed, the COVID response, right? Like Tony washed.
Sure.
Like, so people they knew it was terrible what Trump was doing. They knew that it was inadequate. They knew they were fucking up all over the place. But on the other hand, they would say, but Fauci's still standing there. I talked to a bioethicist I did a lot of conversations on background for this piece to make sure I wasn't getting it all wrong. And one thing she said was, look, in my field, even among public health professionals, the fact that Fauci was standing up there just as an image, that he was there with Trump, he didn't leave, and he didn't contradict him, he didn't blow up at him and resign, it gave people a sense, well, it can't be as bad as it looks, It can't possibly be as bad as it looks, because if it was really bad, Fauci would leave or Fauci would do something. And so the question of where was the big political upheaval, it can't all be laid at Fauci's feet, obviously. But I think that he was definitely a factor in preventing, at least mollifying in some way, placating liberals on the left who were watching this crisis and sort of feeling like it was being done poorly. I don't think that certainly cannot be ignored. I think that in the medical and scientific world, it's also important to acknowledge that Fauci is so incredibly well respected. He's seen as this godfather of infectious disease outbreaks and all that. He's of infectious disease research and the pandemic response. I mean, he is the public face of some scientist in one of the fawning New Yorker profiles said he is the embodiment of infectious disease and public health research project in America. And so the point being that people in that world, medical scientific world, they take their cues from Fauci. And I think it's also true that, for one, Fauci downplaying the virus in the early parts of 2020 made it harder for other people, certainly in government science, to come out and say, actually, it's really bad. Because if Fauci's not saying it's really bad yet, then we shouldn't be saying it's really bad yet. And Fauci probably knows better than we do anyway. And in the same way, I think that by staying inside, by playing the inside game, by not confronting Trump, by not creating some kind of, by not just coming out, and it can happen in a million different ways. Maybe it's just that he keeps contradicting him. They say you can't go on the news. He goes on the news anyway. Whatever, all
Make
the
Trump
ways in
fire him. I mean, become a martyr for the cause. I mean, I know that's a counterfactual sort of scenario.
Yes,
but at the same time, it's kind of like, well, it makes you wonder that if he is this sort of hero to liberals who see him as the voice of reason and science and the quote unquote only adult in the room, then that might have political power. Because he matters to people that matter, if that makes sense.
It's exactly right. I think he does matter to people that matter, people in government, elected representatives who might have been complacent during this time period, and certainly to the medical and scientific world, where I think that if he had been fired, it would have united, most scientists, public health professionals, and doctors behind him. And what political possibilities are open when that happens, I'm not entirely sure. But certainly it might have been a different we'd be in a different timeline. And I think by the same token, as far as grassroots pressure, you're right. There wasn't an uprising about COVID. I mean, I think the uprisings this summer were inflected by the lockdowns, and by the economic fallout of them, and indeed by the fact that COVID was killing Black people at such a disproportionate rate. A lot of material realities contributed to that uprising, but it wasn't an uprising against the government's inadequate response to COVID-19, and something like that might have been possible under different circumstances. Again, I can't lay it all at Fauci's feet.
Yeah, of course. But part of it, what you identify though, is sort of this scary phenomenon that I feel like was accelerated during the Trump years, which is sort of like this projection that from liberals about people in government, and Mueller was a good example, right? It's like, dude, this guy's a fucking FBI dude. Like, come on.
Yeah.
Why are we seeing them? But it's weird because it's almost like a shade of QAnon on the other side. Like there's this sort of like deep. Even like think about like RBG, like all the RBG shit. It's like it's like a failure to really come to terms with the real sort of complexity of these figures and turn them into sort of like Fauci becomes basically like Scully on X-Files. This is like someone who understands science and a crusader for science and the quote unquote adult in the room. Yeah. But like you're saying, I mean, yeah, I'm trying to imagine like what is Fauci's real purpose there in that by staying in that room? Because for me, one of them was the really dangerous thing of like validating everything that Trump was saying and sort of being there is like, oh well, if he is the adult in the room, then he's there, and that is sort of giving the rubber stamp to all the bullshit that Trump is saying. Yeah,
I think that's right. I think this preoccupation with figures like Fauci and Mueller, RBG to some extent, it's I hadn't thought about the QAnon connection. It makes sense. I mean, it's this idea that there's these like righteous people inside the government who are going to fix everything in one fell swoop.
Right.
I think that in the liberal imagination, it is connected to this particularly liberal kind of juridical fantasy of the way politics works. This idea that like facts and logic have some kind of material force in the world, that they will that they're like binding forces in our political life, and that at some level there's got to be the thing that I think that drew liberals to a figure like Mueller, to Fauci, is this idea that there's like this epistemological authority, like this truth matters, facts matter, that's going to come in, intervene, and arbitrate truth and fiction. In the case of Mueller, it was like, yes, the Trump administration is doing all this crazy shit and they're lying all the time, but there's this guy in the background waiting who's going to come in and say, that's true, that's not true, that's good, that's bad. So it's both a religious fantasy of judgment and I think a specifically kind of juridical fantasy of sort of like jurisprudence and precedent.
I was thinking about Atticus Finch as you're talking, and it's sort of like, it's still there. Like that thing among liberals is still there. This sort of like heart-stirring sort of, and connected to things like, rules and legal procedures and all that stuff invested with all that religious authority. It's really, it becomes clear in a year like this for sure.
I totally agree. Yeah. And I think that it's not surprising that Fauci should fall into that role as well. Not only because people were like desperately looking for some source of comfort and sort of grandfatherly warmth and somebody who seemed to be at least invested in telling the truth, but his whole persona was around him being somebody who only tells the truth. I mean, it's a perfect, he slots perfectly into that fantasy. And so, it's as long as Fauci's there, we've got some champion of truth inside the White House. And somehow at some point, like the forces of truth and the forces of falseness are going to do battle. and truth will be victorious. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way.
It does in the movies, though.
Yeah,
it does in all the stories that and the sort of I think they still teach To Kill a Mockingbird in high schools. Like it's still it's still part of our like mythology. And
I mean, I believe in the possibility of like political heroism.
Sure,
I do.
Yeah,
but so I don't, and I don't. I think that it's possible, and in having these conversations, like some of my derision towards sort of resistance libs comes out a little more strongly than I want, or that I tried to keep it at bay in the piece, because it makes sense. Like any kind of like, we're all developing fantasies to deal with the insanity of the past year, and with political reality and in general. So let's like not be, I think about like how we on the left we ridicule the libs for their kind of parasocial fantasies about politicians like Hillary Clinton or RBG or whatever. But every single person I know, pretty much every single person I know, bought that mug with Bernie Sanders on the side wearing the mittens.
Yeah.
So like we're all sick,
It's also because it's sort of like this tacit admission that like that's sort of a necessary part of politics in some way. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like that Bernie...
Politics is cringe.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And also like part of Bernie's... I mean, the fact that Bernie can be memed and that he has that sort of quality about him is important. Everyone like lamented that like, oh, like celebrities are in politics now ever since Kennedy and Nixon and the debate in 1960 or something. It's well, dude, no. Like that's just how there's an erotic part of politics.
Totally.
And like Bernie plays that role. Yeah, it is weird to hear the left like assailing the fucking libs for doing this hero shit, because we do it too. And it's like maybe it's more like let's be realistic about like how useful that shit is.
Yeah, our memes instead of their memes.
There you go.
I wanted to say about the piece in particular that I endeavored to make it so somebody who liked Fauci could read it and nonetheless come away realizing that there was the reason to at least question the exclusively positive account of his role, the hagiographic account. And I hope that it succeeded. Yeah.
I think it's an important one, and I think that's right, because, I mean, people are going to, like I said, I mean, I sort of threw this idea around to people that I know. I was like, oh, I'm going to interview this guy about this piece, and many people were like, well, what is wrong with Fauci? There is like a defensive thing with that. I mean, it would be like, look at the personality investment is intense, dude. I mean, I feel like the left right now is falling apart over like AOC and the squad and like shit like that. And so much of it comes down to like this sort of either personal animus or personal defense of this individual. God, I mean, and that's all to say that I'm not immune to any of it.
Me neither.
You know what I mean? Like I read stuff about AOC one way or the other, and I can be like, in terms of the tone, I can be disgusted or really, really on their side. And I think that's part of the lesson of this year is like, actually, it's part of what I wanted to ask you about, because you've written a lot of really interesting pieces, and I didn't read all of them, but I read a bunch of them and looked at their the sort of main thrust of your work. But one of the things like you write about you wrote about Amazon warehouses and like this in this Bodies episode of Logic magazine. Mm-hmm. And it seems like it's something we come up against on this show a lot, is sort of like the intersection of the human body, and I know there's like a sort of like academic bodies discourse, but I'm more along the lines of just like, how where are these sites in which these things touch us? And it seems like COVID year is more than I've ever seen in my lifetime, a sort of like invasion of politics into the body. That's why it's really, I think, important to understand how Fauci is sort of being disingenuous about that connection, because it seems like he knows too, right? I mean, this is his life. This is his entire life story.
Well, I think, exactly. And it's one of the things that I argue in the piece is that like the lesson of the AIDS crisis was not only do science,
right?
Never do politics,
Right.
The lesson was he was touched by a political upheaval, right? And it changed the way he did science. So like the lesson was that sometimes scientists are going to be affected by political reality, and they have to respond, in the right way. And he did that time, But I think also there's another, I was thinking about this when you were talking about kind of the body, politics in the body.
Yeah.
And I think another thing that Fauci represents is in his leadership at NIAID and kind of his scientific output and the way that he's kind of directed the public health research world, is that he's very representative of what's called like the biomedical model of public health response, a pandemic response, which is to say that primarily what we should do is prepare vaccines for everything. That all of our research should be focused on researching, sequencing these viruses, identifying the ones that might become pandemics, or at least disease outbreaks, severe, deadly ones, and prepare vaccine platforms to respond to them. And the truth is, and I acknowledge this in the piece, that the research agenda of his lab contributed significantly to how quickly we got this vaccine. That approach was probably part of how we were able to sequence this virus so quickly, to develop a vaccine quickly. And the Moderna vaccine was developed in collaboration with NIAID. Mm-hmm. So and the Pfizer vaccine is kind of a ripoff of the Moderna vaccine. And so good for Fauci. On the other hand, the biomedical model means that research funding and just kind of the like locus of research on pandemic potential diseases, disease outbreak in general, and public health is focused on the science, on medicine, on patient by patient, by thinking of disease as something that you solve using science and medicine, instead of public health infrastructure. The things that would have saved lives in this country is not more medicine and not more medical science, right? The medical science was great. We got the vaccine in crazy fast, right? But and we even developed these like treatments pretty quickly, right? But the thing that fucked us was the total hollowing out of health infrastructure, public health infrastructure, and state capacity for health care in this country. And of course, the private provision of healthcare as part of that. But then even more broadly, just neoliberal sort of organization, the economy made it so much harder to respond to this problem. But what I'm saying is that this can't all be put at Fauci's feet, but he is representative of a perspective in infectious disease research, which has focused our attention on curing diseases and creating vaccines, instead of focusing on, well, what happens to a society when there's a pandemic?
Yeah.
And I think that I'm sure that people, if anybody who's like in virology or microbiology or whatever is listening to this, they would probably quibble with like how much he is actually in charge of those decisions, those funding decisions, how much he can. I think it's fair to say he's a synecdoche for a sort of a position in this world. But even beyond that, I mean, we know that Fauci is not somebody who goes out and says, look, this pandemic is killing us because we don't have any public health infrastructure, because we have private insurance because
that would be acknowledging politics, right?
Not because since the 1970s and 80s we've just hollowed out our capacity as
that's everything.
State to
and
he doesn't do that, and I think that that's also damning.
Yeah, I mean that part of it to me is something that we've been hammering since the whole COVID thing began. From going from like predicting what we thought would happen in March to now sitting here and all recognizing that it did happen. I think you and a lot of the people that are sort of on the left with us would agree that like the sort of main lesson of COVID is that it's showed us how unequal American society is and how capitalism has essentially created a scenario in which this pandemic is going to affect people unequally. And if you look at the maps of like New York City or Los Angeles, the map of COVID deaths is a map of that inequality. And even what's fucked up is like the map of the vaccines even maps that inequality now too. Like you're saying like, oh, look, the Upper West Side in Manhattan was the place that was least affected by the virus. And yet they're the ones that are getting the most vaccines right now. You know, all of that to me is something I guess my question is for you. We're talking about like the left, trying to influence national politics. Was that conversation about like class and inequality and race? I mean, all of it, right? Is that it? Was that with? Has Fauci ever said anything about that stuff? And then I guess when you come in with the Biden administration, are we going to see a change in that conversation at all? Because it seems like that's the politics of COVID that's staring at us in the face. Is like how fucked up American society is, and it's putting unequal pressures to the point of death on the working class. It's just like that's to me the hard fact, and I'm not sure where that is. I'm not sure where that is in the larger conversation.
Yeah. Well, I'd say you can find Fauci talking about, I mean, this sort of social determinants of health conversation is hegemonic enough in medicine at this point that everybody talks about it. And you can find him talking about the disproportionate impact of COVID on Black people, poor people. That's not like what his research has been on for the most part,
right.
But he can talk that talk because I think everybody in a public-facing position in medicine and science, medical science at this point, can talk that talk. I don't think it's been... I also think there's a way of talking that talk that is avoids real deeper structural conversations.
Right. It naturalizes it.
Yeah, it's like, well, yeah, like, of course, Black people are suffering more because it's a racist country. And you sort of leave it there. But, like, well, how does racism manifest? Like, what structures create the inequalities and how would we fix them? That, Dr. Fauci, I'm sure, doesn't have anything to say about that. That's not what he does. But,
it's the critical part, too, of that conversation, really.
Yeah, but isn't it amazing how little we have that conversation, despite how widespread the agreement among liberal Democrats is that structural racism is a reality?
Yeah, sure.
We agree that like this is a white supremacist country. Like, it's incredible.
It's extraordinary to see. Especially like, I mean, I don't know. I'm probably a little bit older than you, but I went to college in the 90s, dude. And I remember all this language being like sort of like academic outsider language,
Yes.
And it was like, oh, well, this to me, like, I was like, well, this is the left. This is how the left talks. But then that language, I don't know if the word is co-opted. I don't know. There's a long process there.
Yeah.
But like we've talked about sort of like, what does it mean that Colin Kaepernick has like this huge Nike deal? Is that capitalism winning and taking and absorbing its resistance and making it useless? Or are there going to be like actual real substantive policy changes as part of this, and we have to factor that into our judgment of it? I mean, that's all fucking complicated. I know
it's pretty hard to say. I don't know, but I definitely agree that it's pretty wild that how many elected Democrats you could get to agree like, oh yeah, structural racism is a pervasive force in American culture and economy and life in general. And then when you were to say, okay, well, so should we do this program to eliminate poverty? Should we do this thing to redistribute wealth? Should we do this wealth tax? Should we do this? Do you support this union drive of 80% Black workers at this Amazon warehouse in Alabama?
Mm-hmm.
Like, are you tweeting about it, or like what good is this universal commitment to combat white supremacy in the Democratic Party if it's not rallying every single elected Democrat to the support of these workers in Alabama. You know what I mean?
Which I think you pointed out on Twitter recently that something that was in my mind, which is like, this is a Black Lives Matter issue. This is a Me Too issue. These are the things that supposedly liberals and people with money care a whole lot about.
Yeah.
And like the union drive at Amazon warehouses in Alabama is 100% connected to things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too, and and so. It's odd because it kind of brings up that thing that we all know, that like there's part of this is a sort of cosmetic change,
branding exercise
for neoliberals. Yeah.
I don't know, man. I mean, it's fascinating. I think you are a little bit older than me, but I think even for me, like it's been remarkable to me how unions have become kind of cool with like, people in our milieu. I mean, I guess people on the left always thought we're pro-union, but like young people and kind of like AOC going to a picket line. And I don't know, like I'm bringing this up as kind of like another thing is like, that seems like if the branding stuff could attach itself to like unions as such, that would probably just be good. Like if the Democrats had to be pro-union in order to like, but of course, like this is where the rubber hits the road, is like, it's possible to make a lot of noises about white supremacy without actually supporting, policies that benefit the working class, in its eternal battle against capital. And that the labor movement is where that battle plays out in its most explicit terms. So, it is the test. But I mean, one thing that I thought of kind of throughout this conversation is that like our politics have become way more, they take place in the realm of spectacle more than ever before. That's not controversial or particularly insightful.
Hey, watch the inauguration. Jesus Lord. Yeah.
Yeah. But of course the COVID year, exacerbated that even more because people weren't being able to gather, in public. And so much more of politics, as it was already trending, became this parasocial experience, taking place online. Not entirely parasocial. Of course, people actually have communities online, but the relationship with political figures became even more, kind of a fixation and a spectacle. And so that's just really hard to avoid. And I think that we should be able to acknowledge that it's a problem and representative of a lot of the problems with how we do politics and how ideology functions in the present. But we should also be aware that that's just how it works. And so, I think about the AOC stuff. Like, I really have no patience for the anti-AOC left. I don't know where you stand on it, but like, but it's just like it's so lame, fucking lucky that this person is like the first big like socialist elected. Of this young generation of socialists to Congress. Like she could be a very effective center-right politician, of course, like she's very skilled, we're lucky that she, I mean, I don't want to like sound like, we owe her. I don't mean that, but I mean that like as a person who's been on the left and been invested in certain times in like the electoral possibilities of the left, she is obviously just like very skilled. She's beautiful. Yeah. She's a woman of color, and she's a committed, at least social democrat. We should be so lucky that we get more of them. And obviously, yes, the point is like I understand.
And she's got that meme quality, dude.
Like, the memes, right, exactly. That's the thing that I was trying to get at is like it makes us uncomfortable that she's so good at like manipulating the memes and doing like Twitch and doing which she does the Instagram things all the time. And we have this I think a lot of people on the left have this instinctive suspicion of that stuff because it is connected to this whole way in which our politics has become pure spectacle, and it's not material, and it's not entirely sort of democratic. I mean, it's commercial and blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, you know, just from a kind of like Gramscian like war position.
Yeah, and you gotta also like something we've been talking about too. Is gotta let evolve with the times too. I mean, I have been at times throughout my life definitely the like, you know, very cynical like anti-electoral politics guy. Fuck the Democratic Party. That's where social movements go to die. You know.
Me too.
But at the same time, I'm also like and I think COVID has a lot to do with it. This year has shifted things, and like the whole. I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I taught at NYU among very like, you know, privileged NYU kids who for years, you know, in the Obama years and everything, they're concerned about like what politics was for them were like microaggressions, you know, and like, you know, like, I don't want to call that stuff stupid. I mean, it's part of
but it is kind of stupid.
It's part of a discourse. But at the same time, you know, COVID and showing them like I showed those students how to survive a plague. And I was like, this is, you know, this was like war. These people were fighting for their absolute lives. And like, look at, you have like men and women showing up to the White House with, you know, coffee cans of the ashes of their loved one and fucking throwing on the White House lawn. That's not about microaggression and about like how our feelings here. These people are fighting because they're fucking pissed that their loved ones are fucking dead. I mean, COVID has reproduced that. COVID has reproduced that feeling and brought it to the 21st century. And I'm feeling like the conversation. Part of the reason everyone's fucking pissed at each other right now on the left is because we're all fucking pointing fingers and being like, you know, how we got to this point. But it's also like we're in the midst of a storm, man. And I mean, I don't know where we're headed. And the anti-AOC shit, dude. I mean. Honestly, after the Capitol thing, where and she you know talked about her experience with you know being scared and things like that, to see those left quote unquote dudes being like, oh, AOC is scared and like mocking her in that way, I'm like, you guys are fucking sociopaths. Like, what the fuck is wrong with you?
Piece
like,
of shit.
Yeah, it's just it's shitty politically too. I don't think it reads that great for these guys, but maybe their fucking Patreons are big. I don't know.
I guess so. Yeah.
Anyway.
I mean, it's really interesting to hear you say that stuff about kind of the biopolitics, but also the just like the urgency of the moment, and I think that's right, and I think that we're sort of in this weird spot where we all feel that we know it's true. We know there has to be some kind of reckoning for this year, but we're still demobilized because we still can't really do the things that we might want to do. There's still kind of this like wait and see quality. You know, it kind of feels like, again, the way I felt right before the uprisings over the summer, where it was like everything was so fucking crazy, but there was no like, you know, first step. You know, there was nothing that broke it open. One of the things that my co-host Matt Sitman and I talk about on our podcast a lot is kind of how the pandemic year it reinforces a theme that we talk about on the podcast a lot, which is about how about like frailty. Fragility is kind of a charged word now, but frailty and like vulnerability as political subjectivities in our time. Just that like I think of like the sort of left politics that I kind of came into as a young person. It was much more like you know, aggressive and male and like focused on like fucking shit up, and you know, I mean, even literally like smashy stuff and block and all that stuff. Not that I disavow that stuff altogether, but and even just sort of like the male centric labor movement, the kind of work that was sort of thought of as the essential kind of work of the working class. Whereas now that's the essential, a lot of the sort of most the work of a large portion of the working class now is care work, right, and service work, and the conditions of this year of us all just suffering and experiencing our vulnerability has it's brought back. It's underscored this instinct that I've had for a while that like the politics that we need on the left, not only, but definitely as a part of it, is a politics of recognizing vulnerability and our sort of mutual interdependence. The fact that we rely on each other because we're, in some ways broken and frail mentally or physically or health-wise. And I don't see how you can get through this year without having a greater appreciation for, one, human vulnerability, and two, the fact that we need each other so badly in every dimension.
Yeah, I think that's a really great way of saying it. And I want to mention the name of your podcast is Know Your Enemy, and it's a great podcast, and people should check it out. I know a lot of people already do, but yeah, that vulnerability, frailty, humility. I mean, and that, I think a lot. There's always been attack on the left that's sort of like this hardcore badass left. We need we need a hard left, like tanky shit. We need to just fucking destroy these people. And like I have found that appealing at times too. I mean, maybe it's like a multi-winged project here. But I feel like the left doesn't recognize that. The left is always in camps. It's like, well, you're a tanky and you're this, or you're this, or you're this, or you're this. And that's sort of like we don't really recognize, and I feel like maybe those human qualities of humility and vulnerability are what can, I don't know, transcend those barriers. I'm being very hopey, changey right now, but
this is always the problem. Yeah, we get Matt and I have this problem too because we're both just like fundamentally like sentimental, sappy people.
Yeah.
And so we get to this point in our podcast where we're like, oh, if only we could love each other. But
my co-host cried on the last episode when we were talking about the Night Stalker. So
yeah, but I was gonna say like the instinct. I'm mostly talking positively about instincts that we can incorporate into our concept of left politics and solidarity. But I think that the instinct to respond to AOC's video derisively or dismissively or even suspiciously, it's just a mean-spirited instinct, and I think it is one that is repulsed by vulnerability and frailty.
It's an ugly thing for sure.
Yeah.
Like and honestly, I saw a lot of people that were just kind of saying, like, sort of describing that as like a disturbing development on the left to see see AOC like expose herself literally in this way. And the response is like, fuck you, you're faking it. I mean, what makes you any different from like the QAnon people? I mean, there's part of it that's beyond politics. It's really about like being a fucking decent human being. I know that's not a quantifiable thing,
No.
but I, in a year where people are dying and people are worried about dying, I mean, it's weird because the right always says that the libs are like too sensitive, like they're all a bunch of sensitive snowflakes. But I think we have to like, I don't know, change our vision of what snowflakery means, I suppose.
Yeah, exactly. No, because there's a difference between saying like you should take offense to everything and saying that people, in fact, you could come to the opposite conclusion, that to say that people are flawed and broken in some kind of fundamental way. I mean, my co-host is a Catholic, so he believes in original sin. We're all fallen from the start, but I'm not. But I nonetheless think that we ought to appreciate, assume and approach our politics and our interactions with the people not with like being super careful about offending them, but with an understanding that we're all suffering.
Yeah.
And if you don't do that, and you're constantly suspicious of other people's expressions of pain, I think you're going to be. I think it's a heart hardening disposition and one that is not conducive to solidarity.
Sam, thanks so much for joining me. This was really fun. I think your work is really important, both as a writer and a podcaster.
Thanks, David.
Yeah. So we'll talk to you again soon, hopefully.
I'd love to. Yeah, thanks, man.
All right, that's going to do it for today. I want to thank my guest, Sam Adler-Bell. That was a really fun conversation. I think that last bit about frailty and vulnerability, it's hard not to sound corny when you're talking about that stuff, but I think that, in the future, moving forward, it's a really, really vital part of our work is to recognize the humanity in each other, whatever that might mean. So thanks, Sam, for helping us put words into that stuff and for coming on and talking about this really amazing article in The Drift. Go check that out. It's again called Dr. Dolittle, The Case Against Anthony Fauci. And thanks so much for the people that are supporting the show. Again, you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. I hope you're doing well wherever you are. We will talk to you again very soon. See ya.